One of the most important powers of the Congress is the Commerce Power, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, which gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce. The commerce power was not very clearly defined in the Constitution, and like so many other parts of the Constitution, it's taken years, decades, even centuries of practice to determine what some of those provisions mean. In terms of the Commerce Clause, it was the 1820s when we started to really understand what it meant for Congress to have the authority to regulate commerce. And in the 1824 case Gibbons v. Ogden, the U.S. Supreme Court clarified that Congress could regulate interstate commerce, that is, commerce between the states, but that states retain the authority to regulate intrastate commerce, which is any internal commercial activity within a state's borders. That seems like it should be pretty straightforward, but over time, questions began to develop over what really was interstate versus what was intrastate. So, for example, is manufacturing an item within a state solely an intrastate activity if the materials that were needed came from someplace else? So over time, Congress actually began to regulate more and more dimensions of commercial activity under its authority in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. And today, Congress has broad authority under the Commerce Clause to impose regulations on commercial activity. This makes sense if you think about how commerce takes place now. We sit on our computers and we order something from Amazon.com, and while we're engaging in that activity in a very local way, there's probably a global supply chain that's involved with that commercial act. So Congress has broad authority to be involved with lots of different elements of those activities.
The first case that really where this issue comes to a head is in Gibbons v. Ogden in New York in 1824. And here's a case in which you have a steamboat operator, Mr. Ogden, who essentially has monopoly power to run his steamship from New York along the Hudson River into New Jersey. Okay, so he's actually crossing from one state to another. And Congress obviously is dealing here with a case of navigable waters, where boats are moving from one state to the other, clearly a case of interstate commerce, interstate transaction. Mr. Gibbons comes along and says, well, I want to have the right to run a steamship as well, and he fails in a couple of rounds in state court and even in federal court. But he eventually makes it to the Supreme Court, and Marshall, once again a Federalist, says, look, we need to have uniform laws dealing with interstate commerce, and he uses the Interstate Commerce Clause to justify the Congress's power to regulate the state laws. And in this case, obviously breaking down the monopoly which existed that gave Mr. Ogden his power in the first place. And it said to Mr. Gibbons, under the Constitution, you actually have a right to operate your boat. And that becomes the beginning of essentially a long period where Congress is essentially given a significant amount of power to do most of what it wants. Now, keep in mind that throughout most of through the first half of the 19th century, you essentially have a federalist arrangement where the federal government is not really doing very much, period. And the states are able to pass laws and to essentially maintain their local economies without too much difficulty. And so for a good period of time, there's not a lot of controversy. You get into issues of interstate commerce with industrialization, right? The Congress begins to have to step in because now the country is growing substantially. Population growth is key, and you have people moving westward. You have cities that are growing up in New York and Boston. You have companies that are now building industrial bases in various places. And so Congress now needs to get much more involved. You actually begin to see trusts being built up and monopolies starting to be built up throughout throughout parts of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Sherman Antitrust Act is a good example. And so Congress now has to get involved in regulating on a much more active basis as the economy grows and it becomes more diversified. And essentially all the way up and through the 30s, the court essentially allows Congress pretty much to decide what to do.
Personally, I think one of the most interesting examples has to do with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which is cast in part as a matter of the Commerce Clause, because the framing of the Civil Rights Act is what you can and can't do if you're engaged in interstate commerce. And the main thing you can't do if you're engaged in interstate commerce is you can't discriminate based on race and other conditions. Now, the question is, what is interstate commerce? Well, it turns out that no man or woman is an island. And try as you might not to engage in interstate commerce. You have a phone, you're engaged in interstate commerce. You use a bottle of ketchup that comes from Pennsylvania, you're engaged in interstate commerce. So it's virtually impossible not to be engaged in interstate commerce. And so we take a bill that some people at the time might have argued that was not quite within the purview of what was in the written Constitution. It gets folded into the Commerce Clause, and suddenly Congress is able to act in a wide variety of ways. And you can kind of go down the list. For instance, you can also end up criminalizing under the federal statutes a lot of laws that Congress used to say nothing about. There used to be a division between the states and the federal government over the police power. But it turns out that firearms travel in interstate commerce. So over the last several decades as well, federal criminal law has developed, and Congress has gotten involved in writing new federal criminal statutes to federalize a lot of criminal law, because a lot of crimes are committed using firearms. And if they travel in interstate commerce, that gives a opening for Congress then to start writing new types of criminal law that they never could have written before.
In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Supreme Court looked at a number of different ways that Congress had tried to engage in regulation of interstate commerce. Congress had enacted legislation involving a minimum wage. It had enacted legislation that would ban child labor. It enacted legislation that was aimed at improving working conditions. And originally, all of those laws were challenged as an unconstitutional use of the Commerce Clause authority. The Supreme Court disagreed with that. In all of those cases, the court came back and said, no, Congress can regulate these things because it's a regulation on instruments of commerce or regulations on the means of engaging in commercial production. And so those are examples of types of things Congress has used the Commerce Clause to try to regulate and where Congress has been successful. The Supreme Court and Congress have been jockeying back and forth recently over what's an appropriate use of Congress's Commerce Clause authority. In the mid-90s, Congress passed two laws. One was the Gun-Free School Zones Act. The other was the Violence Against Women Act, and tried to claim that some of the penalties that they were imposing were being imposed using their Commerce Clause authority. And ultimately, the Supreme Court struck both of those down as being an unconstitutional use of Commerce Clause authority. On the other hand, more recently, you have the Supreme Court upholding Congress's right under the Controlled Substances Act to regulate medicinal marijuana grown entirely within a state that has approved marijuana for that purpose. But at the same time, just recently in the Affordable Care Act, the court struck down Congress's use of the Commerce Clause to justify requiring people to purchase health insurance. The court said that Congress could do that, but only using its taxation power, not using its Commerce Clause authority. So I think right now we're in a period of time where the courts and Congress are trying to work through exactly what that Commerce Clause authority really means.